Well, hi everybody. It's good to see you. I hope yous are well. Won't you pull you up a chair and set a spell while I share the story of Granny Messick from Mountain Home, Arkansas. Ruby Catherine Messick, born in 1797 in North Carolina. Her parents were Richard and Ruby Catherine Conover Messick. They came from Ozark and Lorraine, an area that was first German, then French, and it is often argued whether they were German or French, but with the name like Conover being German. On March 20th, 1814, Ruby had a son in Coffee County, Tennessee, giving him the name John Wesley Messick. Later that same year, on October 16th, 1814, she had a daughter, giving her the name of Linda Ann Messick. Both John and Ann were born out of wedlock. Ruby Messick was never legally married. Could be that old mountain tradition was observed until a man of the cloth would come by on his circuit. Some traditions were like jumping on a broomstick, falling off backwards, or just simply saying we're married was good enough. It was told before the circuit rider came by, her man rode off with Colonel Andrew Jackson to fight in the Indian Wars. Sadly, he never returned. After moving to Arkansas, Ruby Catherine had John and his children enrolled on the Davis's roll as members of the Cherokee Nation. So here is a little mystery. Was her man really killed by Jackson? Or as an American Indian serving as a scout for the Old Hickory? We will never know the answer to that question. Of her man caused Ruby Catherine to become mentally unstable for the rest of her life. One of her own grandchildren described her as being a little nutty and smoking a stinky old clay pipe. Why is Ruby Messick important for me to tell the story? Well, the legend has it she's an old Ozark mountain witch. She was a small woman, no bigger than a washing pot. Her eyes black as coal and piercing sharp as a sewing needle. She had long black hair, never once wearing it done up like sophisticated mature woman of the time did. Nope, never even once. In her own mind, she was always a young girl awaiting the return of her man. The way she looked and her actions, plus her mountain with the powers, give notion that she was a witch. She always used her gifts for good, never profiting a penny. She could stop a bad bleed, take the heat out of a burn, and cure thrush in a body. She was never feared. Besides, who would want to be a fighting with an old mountain witch healer when the closest doctor was a mighty long ways away? Ruby Catherine's father cherished her so much along with her brothers, and he reflected that in his will. Her son treated her with love and care. He kept her close by his entire life. Even in death, he wasn't buried by either of his wives, rather by his mother. Their exact locations were lost. No one knows where they were buried. In 1832, John married Celia Wilkerson, having 12 children together. Lydia Ann married Celia's brother James Alfred Wilkerson. In 1856, they all came by wagon train to Arkansas, where they settled just south of Yellville on Mill Creek, now known as New Hope Community. Celia died in 1857. Ruby Catherine helped take care of the 7 children still at home. Ruby Catherine became a legend when she lived at Pasco's mill on Upper Mill Creek. Times were rough. The young men and boys were all fighting, leaving easy pickings for outlaws and bands, bushwhackers, to raid, ravish, and unfortunately violate the women and girls. The mills there were their favorite targets. They would carry the grain and mill, and what they couldn't carry, they would destroy. They would then crush the grindstones and burn the mill. Pasco's mill, being the only one left in operation in 1874, the men and women gathered there to have what corn ground into mill saved for their winter stash. The men were at the mill whittling and chewing tobacco and spinning tales, and the women were in the house sharing recipes, quilt patterns, and gossiping. And the kiddos, well, they were outside playing tag. And all of a sudden, a large group of horsemen approached. Now, since there were no soldiers in the area, it could only be one thing: those old bushwhackers. The men ran to hide the corn. The women hid the children. Not a soul knew what to do but one old woman, Granny Messick. She ran out with her arms open wide to meet her long-awaited lover. The horseman galloped into the yard, and old Mord, he was the most feared of all outlaws. As she ran towards him, he instinctively reached out and embraced her, then looked into her wild black eyes, shook her loose, leapt onto his horse, and ran away with his men, as if the devil himself was after him. From then on, old Morg sent word to all to stay away from Pasco's mill. There's a wild woman there. With that simple act, Pasco mill was saved. They never touched the 50 folks or the winter supply of bread. In 1866, John remarried and moved over to the prairie, where he died in 1894. He was buried somewhere on his old home place. Only 5 years later, Ruby Catherine passed and was placed by his side so they could be together forever. But just before she passed, the steamboat Rosewood exploded and burned the White River. Dr. John Marler ran to the scene where he saw burning and bleeding passengers. He did the only thing he knew to do, sending for Ruby Catherine. The fastest horseman ran after. At 102 years old, she came holding on for dear life. It was told you could see her long locks floating in the wind as the horse flew to the scene. Old Granny Messick has hundreds of descendants today. I wrote the information in this story from her third great granddaughter. I just thought I would use her information so the story would be the most accurate to share the history in her story. Well, folks, I sure hope you enjoyed the story of old Granny Messick. Do you believe she was a mountain witch, or just an old lady who knew a lot of the old Cherokee remedies, using from the mountains, the hollers and hills of plants, and all the knowledge that the Cherokee had? Folks, I sure do appreciate you listening to me. We love you to pieces, and we'll see you next time.